I've never shared with you guys my thoughts on the Pac-12 collapse. It was obviously a sensitive subject when I was working for the conference. Wasn't able to fully dive into it, but now with last week's announcement that George Kliavkoff gone as the Pac-12 commissioner, felt like now was a good time to do so. And yes, the Pac-12 still technically exists with Oregon State and Washington State running the show for the future of that conference. Obviously, in reality, it's only the Pac-2, but technically the Pac-12 still exists. And this graphic that I'll throw up right here, I thought that good job of walking through the events that have taken place since 2021 when George Kliavkoff took over that let's dive into. And before we do that, gentlemen's agreement, if this is the second video you watched of mine, consider hitting that subscribe button. Help support the channel. If it's just the first time, it's the first time you're seeing my face, I got to earn that subscription. But if you're coming back again, must have liked something, consider hitting that subscribe button down below and drop a like and comment if you feel inclined. But to start, big picture, I think George Kliavkoff is unfairly going to get the majority of the heat for the conference folding as we move on down the line, 5-10 years down the road. When the reality is a lot of these events were in motion long before he was at the helm. And I know it's his job to come up with solutions and not excuses, and it was his job to right the ship. But 5-10 years down the road, when the average sports fan loses track of the nuances and the average sports fan not watching this video forgets a lot of these events, it's going to be, oh, it folded under Kliavkoff. But the reality is the previous regime with Larry Scott is a big reason why the conference got in this place in the first place. When Kliavkoff was first hired as commissioner, people were all fired up because he was an outsider. That was viewed as a strength. He came from the Las Vegas MGM media scene, and the thought process of having someone from the outside with fresh ideas, fresh perspective, would be able to see where the puck's going, not only with college sports, but specifically with TV deals and media deals, that was a strength. People were excited about Kliavkoff. I think rightfully so at that time. But when we go down to that fourth bullet point, USC and UCLA to the Big Ten, by going and getting an outsider, I think this left the conference vulnerable because it's unrealistic to expect Kliavkoff to have a pulse on the fact that USC's seriously considering moving conferences. At that time, it was crazy talk, right? USC moving to the Big Ten? Nah, USC is the Pac-12. By Kliavkoff not having a pulse on that situation, not necessarily having those relationships, maybe not having the street cred to really sit USC down and say what's going on, or potentially piss off USC. What I've heard is USC was the reason the conference didn't expand because they didn't think the remaining Big 12 institutions were prestigious enough. And you fast forward a calendar year and USC is the one jumping ship. That's a tough spot to be in as an outsider. His first big move was forming the alliance with the ACC and the Big 12. That was all just a PR deal. Nothing substantive really came of that alliance, but it was the right move at the time because that's when the narrative in college football was not the Big Two. It wasn't just ACC and SEC. It was, hey, this is the SEC show and all the other conferences are in trouble. And there's a reason this alliance does not have the Big 12. And that's what people forget about. This alliance with the ACC and the Big 10, because the Big 12 was the conference that had the perception that they were scrambling. Nowadays, it's easy to position the Pac-12 as, oh, the weakest conference. Well, no, the Big 12 ultimately just outmaneuvered the Pac-12. But at this time, there's a reason it was ACC, Big 10, and Pac-12, because there was the perception that all three of those conferences had some level of security. It's ironic looking back on it because obviously the Big 10 poached USC and UCLA, but at the time, it was perceived as if they were in the ship together. But nothing really came of that. The third bullet point, moving the headquarters away from San Francisco. This point speaks to the overspending of the conference earlier on in the decade, right? You get the fancy office space in downtown San Francisco. You always hear about like Larry Scott's private jets and whatnot, but an overspending by the conference early on in the decade that hurt the conference later on in the decade and into the 2020s because you didn't have the cash on hand to invest in new initiatives to change the narrative of the conference or grow the exposure of the conference across different mediums. Because you overspent it earlier on, you were somewhat pigeonholed later on, which isn't the reason the conference ultimately dissolved, but it certainly was a factor. We talked about USC and UCLA leaving, and in Colorado, that fifth bullet point, Colorado is the factor that the significance of that jump is going to be lost 10 years from now, right? We're always going to remember USC and UCLA, but we're going to lose track of the significance of Colorado in this moment. Here's what I mean. At this point, before Colorado had jumped, all the schools were were staying pat. Oregon and Washington, they were good to stay in the Pac-12, or at least wait out what potentially would have been a media deal. The four corner schools, or I guess three corner schools, Utah, Arizona, Arizona State, they weren't necessarily jumping ship. There were reports that they were gearing up to, but Colorado was the big domino to fall. And Colorado is interesting because this whole situation could have been a lot different if Colorado had more success in the Pac-12. Colorado was one of the worst football programs over the past decade in the Pac-12. So it was easy for that fan base and that administration to tell themselves the narrative of, we got to go back to our roots. We got to go back to the Big 12, a conference where we were once national champions. We're not meant for the West Coast ties. We got to get back to our Texas recruiting ties. That narrative was easy to tell yourselves if you're Colorado, coupled with the fact that because Coach Prime had come on the scene, and it's crazy that Coach Prime may have had a factor in conference realignment conversations, but the marketability of Colorado raised substantially over that one calendar year because you got Coach Prime. And if you're Colorado's administration, you're sitting there saying, we haven't had a great football program. Who knows? Coach Prime could leave in a year. The marketability of our athletic program has raised significantly. We got to make sure we secure ourselves a seat at the table. And if the Big 12 wants us, we don't necessarily know what's going on with the Pac-12. We got to jump ship. And that story is easy to tell yourself. And I don't blame necessarily Colorado for doing that per se. But once Colorado left, then it was like, all right, Arizona, Arizona State, Utah, they got to look out for themselves. They secure a spot in the Big 12, and then obviously Oregon and Washington, and the rest of the dominoes fall. Two big takeaways that when this video ages and we watch this 3 years down the road, or some youngster right now is watching this video way down the road saying, what happened with the Pac-12? Two big factors that I think people lose track of. One, the Big 12's here and the Pac-12 is dissolving, not because the Big 12 had so many more valuable programs, but because the Big 12 was able to act quicker than the Pac-12. A decade from now, I have a feeling people are going to look back and be like, the narrative's going to be, oh, the Pac-12 and West Coast football, there just wasn't that intrigue and it just wasn't the same, and that's why the conference folded. Sure, that might be a factor relative to, Big 10 and SEC country, but when you compare it to Big 12 country, that's just not the case. The Big 12 was able to rally the troops in a way that the Pac-12 was not. It was a better business move, and they were able to do that because in the Pac-12, there were schools at different tiers, right? USC, Washington, Oregon, UCLA, they think that they should be getting the Big 10 money versus Washington State and Corvallis is like, hey, we'd be stoked if we got the Big 12 money. On the other hand, all the Big 12 schools, they're all part of the same relative tier. And as a result, they were all able to get on the same page, band together and say, hey, even if our media deal is 45 cents on the dollar relative to the Big 10, we'll still take it because it secures our future as an athletic program. The Pac-12 wasn't able to do that. The Big 12 was, and that's why there are the four major conferences that still exist and the Pac-12 is folded. And then two, on the same light, the Pac-12 folding is not a result of a lack of value. These other conferences, they're not in the business of just doing a good cause and picking up these schools because they feel like it's the right thing to do. No, they're picking up these schools because there's value with these schools. Again, I could see a narrative down the road of like, oh, there just wasn't intrigue. Nah. We're going to see Washington and Oregon be mainstays in the Big 10. We're about to see Utah be, in my opinion, the best football program in the Big 12 conference next year. It's not like it was just some group of five school. That's not what we're talking about. We got here because of a lack of strategic business moves, not a lack of value in West Coast Pac-12 football. Let me know what you agree with. Let me know what you disagree with. If you like this video, consider hitting the subscribe and like button down below, and hang around and check out these next two videos recommended just for you.